Thank you very much for a very, very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come here to speak about something that I think we probably all find interesting in one way or another. I will just speak for the next about 20 minutes or so. About this topic, are the Gospels historically reliable? I will start by referring you to one of the great persons in Danish intellectual history, Georg Brandes. Brandes was born in 1842 and died in 27. In 1870, he defended his doctoral habilitation and obtained a jus docendi at the University of Copenhagen. That means that he was allowed to give lectures. And this right he used several times and gave some of the most famous and influential lectures at this university. He was, however, never called as a professor. When the chair in aesthetics was opened in 1872, he applied, but he was too controversial to be appointed. But as everybody knew that he by far was the most competent in his field, the university did not call a professor for the next 20 years. Brandes was the main figure in the so-called, and I don't really know the English translation, but the modern breakthrough, the moderne gennembrud, modern breakthrough. That is the intellectual and artistic movement around the turn of the last century that was characterized by a harsh criticism of traditional authorities and institutions. Brandes was in contact with the leading poets and authors, that is, for instance, Henrik Ibsen and August Strindberg, and he more or less formulated the program of this period in his famous lecture, Movements in Newer European Literature. Brandes had a huge literary production and introduced several European authors to a Danish audience, among them Friedrich Nietzsche, with whom he also wrote letters. As one can imagine, Brandes was also very critical towards religion. Along with several of his famous contemporaries, he promoted Darwin's ideas and insisted on scientific explanations. He also turned against the church and rejected its authority in moral questions. He was, of course, an atheist. All of this is no surprise. Through the 20th century, these positions have become more or less mainstream among many critical intellectuals. But Brandes took one step further. He was critical towards Jesus himself. Towards the end of his life, he wrote a small book about Jesus in which he claimed that he had never existed. Like Wilhelm Tell in Switzerland, Jesus was a fictional figure without any historical reality. The leaders of the early community had invented all the stories in the New Testament in order to guard their authority. Therefore, the Gospels are filled with contradictions and discrepancies. The figure of Jesus does not have a uniform character because the authors have used him to promote different ideals. In the end of his book, Brandes refers to Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard asks if it's possible to learn anything about Christ from history. He answers, no. And Brandes comments, I quote in my translation from the Danish, translated to the way we think today, this means the following. It does not affect the divine creatures that their true life, their only life, is in the mind of humans. End of quote. Brandes is, to my knowledge, quite alone with his radical understanding of Jesus. I do not know of any serious scholar that denies the historical existence of a person by the name of Jesus, to which the New Testament writings refer. On the other hand, I do not know any serious scholar that claims that the entire New Testament is the exact detailed historical truth about Jesus. Almost all scholars agree that there was a historical Jesus that lived and died in Palestine in the beginning of the 1st century, and they agree that all the New Testament writings about him are motivated by the belief in him as Messiah, Savior, and Son of God, and that this belief has influenced the way they write about him. For that reason, they also differ from each other. This does not mean that the Gospel does not contain historical facts about Jesus, but it does mean that they are not all in complete agreement. Some scholars, for instance, think that the author of the fourth Gospel had access to an independent tradition that is older than the synoptic tradition, and therefore is just as historically reliable as the three other Gospels. But if this is correct, it must mean that the synoptics are wrong in the way they present Jesus' life. It is a quite radical position to claim priority of John over the synoptics, but this does not mean that there cannot be details in the fourth Gospel that are even more historically accurate than in the synoptics. Just one example. In the synoptics, Jesus begins his activity after John the Baptist has been incarcerated. In the fourth Gospel, their periods overlap so that they are active at the same time. In the synoptics, Jesus works for about a year. In the fourth Gospel, his activities extend over several years. In the synoptics, Jesus goes up to Jerusalem only once. In the fourth Gospel, he attends several Jewish feasts in Jerusalem. A lot of scholars tend to argue that the fourth Gospel is later than the synoptics and express a so-called spiritual interpretation of Jesus, but with regard to some details, even quite important ones concerning the life of Jesus, it need not be so. Another question. What did Jesus say? In two of the Gospels, Jesus said that the poor are blessed in the Sermon on the Mount and Sermon on the Plain. In the two others, he does not say so. Is it historically reliable that the historical Jesus said this or not? If he did, why did the two other evangelists not report it? The ordinary answer to this question is that this Jesus saying was originally recorded in a work that is now lost. We call it Q because it was a source, in German Quelle, to two evangelists, namely Matthew and Luke. But Mark did not know this source Q. Therefore, a lot of scholars say it is quite likely that the historical Jesus in fact did say something like, "Blessed are the poor," because the author of Q wrote it down in a work that contained a lot of Jesus sayings. Matthew and Luke quoted this work that has been completely lost since then. This goes by the way for a lot of other very famous Jesus sayings. They are also supposed to belong to the lost word Q, for instance, the Lord's Prayer, but this theory is dependent on a specific understanding of the relation between the three synoptic gospels. This theory is known as the two-source theory because Mark and Q were the two sources for Matthew and Luke. But what if the two-source theory is wrong? What if Luke knew the Gospel of Matthew and had the Jesus sayings from that Gospel? Luke does, after all, say that others have written about Jesus before him. This theory is sometimes called the LM theory. If the Maccarism is a saying from the historical Jesus, then Matthew should have known something about Jesus that Mark did not know, and Luke then took over from Matthew. Both theories raises the problem of what Jesus really said. In Matthew, he says, "Blessed are the poor." In Luke, it is, "Blessed are the poor." That's the other way around. In Matthew, it's in Luke he says, "Blessed are the poor." In Matthew, it's, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." According to the LM theory, Luke has copied from Matthew. Therefore, Matthew must be oldest and closest to the original. If he did not invent it all by himself. In the two-source theory, neither Matthew nor Luke is the oldest source, but the otherwise unknown Q, which they both copied from. But did Q say poor or poor in the spirit? The majority of Q scholars thinks that Luke is closest to the original, and Jesus therefore must have said poor and not poor in the spirit. It is, however, pretty easy to explain why Luke would have changed poor in the spirit to poor, as it fits his theology better. So what did Jesus actually say? Of course, one might say that both Gospels are true. Jesus gave two very similar speeches, one on a mountain and one on a plain. Matthew and his source heard the first one, and Luke had access to the second. This almost fundamentalistic theory is not defended by many critical scholars, but may be a common understanding for many Christians. Still, one must retort that even this approach to the New Testament does not give access to what Jesus really said, because Jesus spoke Aramaic and not Greek. So, and what about the events in Jesus' life? Several activities are recorded in all three synoptic Gospels, some even in all four of them. The action in the temple, for instance. What is this action that is commonly known as the cleansing of the temple? This is attested in all four New Testament Gospels. There are differences though. In John, it is placed in the beginning of his public ministry. In the three others, it introduces his activities in Jerusalem. In two of the Gospels, the cursing of the fig tree surrounds the temple action, so that the withered tree illustrates the fate of the temple. Some of the details in the description of Jesus' action differ in the different accounts. But this is only detail. The fact that Jesus made some kind of event in the temple in Jerusalem is common to all Gospels. But does this mean that it is a reliable historical fact? Does it mean anything but that three Gospels in some way or another are dependent on one? That is, if there is some kind of synoptic relation, the two-source theory or another theory, and if the fourth Gospel had a relation to one of the synoptics, which is quite common to think, the agreements between the Gospels does not have to prove anything but the relation between the Gospels. In principle, this goes for all the events that are testified in more than one Gospel. This argument that I have tried to promote here, that one might call an argument ad absurdum, is really not meant to be an argument in favor of Brandes and the like, and his denial of the historical Jesus. My argument is not even meant to be an argument in favor of a position that that a few decades ago was quite popular in Denmark. You may call it Brandes Light, namely that Jesus of Nazareth indeed was a historical person, but it's impossible to know anything about him. My purpose is only to drive home a very simple hermeneutical point, namely that the historical Jesus is always a product of the interpreter. We do not and cannot have access to a historical truth behind the Gospels without going through the Gospels. This means that we have to interpret the texts in order to get any information from them. So the interpreter is deeply involved in the process of interpretation, so that any result will be dependent on him or her. I must stress that I do not argue that it is impossible to know anything about the historical Jesus, or that there is no historical information in the Gospel. I claim that our knowledge of the historical Jesus and the so-called historical facts in the Gospels are all dependent on the interpreter's decisions about what may count as historical and what not. In other words, any construction of the historical Jesus on the basis of the Gospels, or for that matter any other source, depends on criteria. That is, what is considered to constitute a historical reliable fact and what is not considered to constitute a historical reliable fact. These criteria decide how a construction of the historical Jesus may look like. I'll just mention a few examples of the discussions about relevant criteria. An older source is usually considered to be more reliable than a younger one. But this means that one has to have a theory about the relations between the Gospels before any judgment about historical reliability can be made. Often it is considered to be historically unreliable that historical persons speak about situations that clearly belong to a later period than the historical person in question. In the study of, that's another criteria. In the study of historical Jesus, it is a common criteria that sayings or events in the Gospels that express the belief of the community several decades after Jesus' death are unreliable. Stories about obvious violations of natural laws are also considered to be unreliable, and so on. There is several more or less explicit criteria for the reconstruction of the historical Jesus. It is a scholarly debate to reach consensus about which criteria should apply. But it does not change the fundamental view that criteria are always at play in the construction of a possible historical reality. It will never be reality, but only a more or less controversial construction of reality. At the moment, I think it is most common to explain the historical Jesus on the basis of a criteria of plausibility. That is, pieces of information about Jesus are considered historically reliable if they seem plausible in the historical context of a first-century Galilean Jew. Therefore, pieces of information about Jesus that seem unlikely in that context are excluded from the construction of a historical Jesus. But this could be conceived of quite differently. Maybe it is exactly those parts of Jesus' ministry that nobody expected that are the reliable ones. One might also say that dogmatic statements and expressions that derive from the belief that Jesus is the Son of God and therefore confirm the creeds of the Church probably does not derive from Jesus himself, but from the evangelists. There are sayings in the Gospel that seem to conflict with the creeds more likely to be from Jesus. But this presupposes a specific theory of the relation between Jesus and the later church and between the evangelists and the development of the creeds. Such theories are objects for discussion, of course, and may change over time. This goes, as I just hinted at, of course, a fortiori for all the miraculous events in the Gospels. According to which criteria can they be evaluated? In a materialistic worldview that many scholars insist on, they cannot be considered realistic as miracles. That Jesus miraculously walked on water cannot be a historical event. If, however, as I have heard somebody claim, the Sea of Galilee was partly frozen at the time, one may consider it a historical reliable that Jesus walked on ice. But then it is not a miracle. According to most criteria for the construction of history, miracles and divine interventions cannot be part of a realistic history. But I guess some would say that this is a very reductive approach to reality and claim that we need more open and inclusive criteria. And then it is open for another construction of the historical Jesus. I think that my point is clear. And again, I do not agree with Brandes. I think that we from the Gospels can construct a historical Jesus that is realistic. The history of interpretation show, however, that different times construct different Jesuses. Sometimes he is supposed to be a radical, apocalyptic prophet. In other times, he is conceived of as a provocative Hellenistic philosopher. Again, in other times, he is understood as a preacher of ethics and morals. I think that it says a lot about the time in which the historical Jesus was constructed, and maybe less about the historical Jesus himself. So, to answer the question for this afternoon, it is not so much a matter of the character of the gospel, but of the constructions of Jesus. The question is whether a construction of the historical Jesus can be accepted as historically accurate, and on what grounds it can be considered realistic. All the Gospels cannot in their entirety be historical reliable accounts according to all criteria, but parts of the Gospels can according to some criteria. If one must insist on the historical reliability of everything in the Gospel, another question arises, I think, namely why. What would the consequence be if it were true? There may be a lot of consequences, of course, but according to Brandes and Søren Kierkegaard, Christianity would not be influenced. Because as Kierkegaard pointed out, it is not possible to learn anything about Christ by way of history. Therefore, it does not change anything that he only lives in the mind of the believers. And to be honest, I thought of giving this short speech that now comes to an end. I thought of giving it a question as a title, and really an honest question, even though it may seem provocative. I thought about calling it, are the Gospels historical, reliable accounts? Who cares? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jesper. That was great to listen to. I enjoyed that. I want to thank Veritas Forum and everyone involved here for inviting me to come participate in this. I've been looking forward to coming to Scandinavia. This is my first time in Scandinavia. You all have a beautiful country, and this is wonderful. It really is. Now I have to, in a few days, go back to the United States to all the political mess there. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you. Okay, well, I think what I'd like to do is just comment on a few things that Jesper said, and then I want to present a little bit different of an angle. There's going to be some things, a number of things in which Jesper and I agree, and some things in which we don't. I still respect him and like him from what I've seen in our talk here. So, but we are going to have some disagreements, and that's okay. We're adults. So I do agree with him that almost all scholars agree that New Testament writers were motivated by their belief that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God. Of course, that's only natural. Jewish historians who are writing on the Holocaust are all motivated by their belief that it occurred, and they're motivated because they don't want to see that happen again. The disciples were motivated because they believed Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, and they believed his message, and they wanted others to know it. So whether they believe something, and I don't think Jesper would disagree with me at all. It has nothing to do with whether it's truth that they're reporting. We don't say that a writing is wrong because someone has an agenda or they're biased. Richard Dawkins at Oxford, a militant atheist, said that in his book, The God Delusion, if this book works as I intend, religious readers who pick it up will be atheists when they put it down. So someone like Dawkins is very biased, and he has an agenda when he's writing the book. Now that doesn't mean that what his arguments, that he's wrong in his conclusion. He's wrong because his arguments are poor. Even Michael Ruse, a prominent atheist philosopher of science who teaches at Florida State University, said that as an atheist, Dawkins' book was so poorly written, it made him embarrassed to be an atheist. So it's, again, but it's not because he's biased or has an agenda in writing that makes it wrong. You have to look at the evidence, the arguments. Okay, so he talked about how Jesper mentioned how some scholars think John is based on earlier tradition than the Synoptics. That's correct. Some do, some don't. There are some differences between John and the Synoptics. There's at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, there's a whole section called Jesus, John, and History, trying to figure out what John is doing. Because when you read the Gospel of John, Jesus in John sounds so much different than he does in the Synoptics. He sounds more like John in 1 John. I mean, the language, the syntax, the tone, everything is so similar. And there's so many differences between John and the Synoptics. There's various explanations for that. They try to figure it out. Is John, everybody seems to agree that John has taken Jesus and paraphrasing him and recasting it in Johannine idiom. Now, how much further he goes than that is what's debated. And even a prominent New Testament scholar like N.T. Wright would say, I think of John like I think of my wife. I love her very much, but I don't claim to understand her. So then we come and ask, what did Jesus say? Jesper asks. And he said, when you look at Matthew and Luke, they say, they have in the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, whereas Mark and John do not report it. I mean, I don't have any problem with that. Historians are selecting what they report. Josephus, when he wrote his Antiquities or Histories of the Jews, he's reporting all these events of the Jews, and yet he neglects to mention that the Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. Well, we know what happened because Suetonius reports it in his Life of Claudius, section 25, and Luke reports it in the book of Acts. So we have multiple independent sources here. We know what happened, but Josephus, who we would expect to report it, does not report it. Josephus, in his autobiography, doesn't mention his capture by the Romans. You'd think he'd mention that. It's kind of big, but he doesn't. He mentions it in Jewish war. So that Mark and John don't mention the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think that's remarkable. What did Jesus actually say when he's saying the Sermon on the Mount, and any sayings we have? I do agree entirely with Jesper that we're probably not reading the exact words of Jesus, because Jesus primarily spoke in Aramaic and the Gospels are in Greek. Now, I'm sure that Jesus did speak in Greek plenty of times, and probably some of the times, like when he's before Pilate at his trial. He and Pilate are probably, like in Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, Jesus speaks in Aramaic, Pilate speaks in Latin. It probably didn't happen that way. They probably spoke in Greek so that they could understand one another. Either that or an interpreter. So Greek was the lingua franca. And there's a lot of evidence that the Greek was a common language in Jerusalem. So you've got Greek, Aramaic, and many times to Greek. And then if you look in the compositional textbooks written by Theon and Quintilian and Athonius and others written around the time of Jesus, a little before and after, they give these exercises during a teen's secondary and tertiary education in which they were taught how to paraphrase. They weren't supposed to repeat things verbatim. It's kind of like when you're writing your papers, you're not supposed to copy. That's plagiarism. Back then, it was bad too, not because it was considered unethical. It was just considered good literary writing if you paraphrased, and they provided numerous different ways to do that, by expanding, by condensing, by changing a statement to a question, or changing a statement to a dialogue, and all these kinds of things that you would do to paraphrase that were acceptable. And there are a lot of differences between the Gospels, especially interesting when you look at the Synoptics. And when you compare them, I've spent a number of years doing this, and when you look at the differences in the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke report the same thing, the overwhelming majority of those can be easily, plausibly, in fact, I think most plausibly accounted for by the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, paraphrasing and doing what they were taught to do. Not only that, but also other literary techniques that were taught, and that we see other writers like Plutarch of that same period doing the same kinds of stuff. Compressing an account as though it happened over a shorter period of time than it actually had. Conflating, you take some, you may not want to tell two whole stories, so you abbreviate for economy. You take some elements from one story and you commingle it with another, and you get some of those elements all out there, but it's in one story instead of two. It's kind of like conflating characters that may be historical characters in a movie, so you simplify it. So those things were all allowed in ancient biography and historical writing, and we see the gospel authors doing it just like we see Plutarch and others do it, and Plutarch is regarded as the high mark of ancient biographical writing. He is considered to be the greatest ancient biographer, and he does these things. So we shouldn't fault the Gospels if they do it. So in terms of what Jesus said, we can see some sort of paraphrasing and literary techniques, compositional devices going on. Jesper mentioned about the Q hypothesis. I don't know where he's at with this. I do embrace the Q hypothesis. I think it's probable. Most New Testament scholars go with Q, although they don't know if it's written or oral. I think a little majority would say it's written. We don't know what it was. It would have been a lost source. I think that it's possible it could have been what Papias refers to, that Matthew originally wrote the Taalagia, the sayings of Jesus, in Aramaic. And because that's what Q is. It's the sayings of Jesus. It's not narrative. And so Matthew it could have been that Matthew took some notes of Jesus. He would have been literate as a tax collector. He could have taken notes of what Jesus had taught, took it along with him. After Mark wrote his gospel, someone said, "Hey, Matt, why don't you write one?" He says, "All right," and he gets a scribe, and he says, let's use Mark as our primary source, and let's expand. Hey, take these notes I have from Jesus' teaching, translate them into Greek, and then we'll use that and supplement Mark and maybe some other sources. That could very well be what we have with Q. And think about that. If that is what it is, we've got a source that goes back to the days in which Jesus actually was living. that's included in Matthew's gospel. All right, what did Jesus do, he asked. So we dealt with what Jesus said. What about what he did? He said that the temple cleansing, John places it at the beginning. The synoptics place it at the end. Yep, and I would guess that John has done one of those things that was certainly permissible within ancient biography, and that is to displace an event from its original chronological context and transplant it in another. We see John doing this elsewhere, like the woman who anoints Jesus. He takes it from 2 days before Passover and moves it back to 6 days before Passover. I could give you reasons why he did that. He's just following rules of like what Lucian of Samosata says in his book, How to Write History, that you link events together like links in a chain using overlapping material. And it just so happens that he links the anointing of Jesus with right after he raises Lazarus from the dead, because it's Lazarus' sister Mary who anoints him. And so he links those two events and marries the overlapping material. Again, just the kind of stuff that Lucian said a good writer should do. So I would not consider that a contradiction. I guess you could say it is in the most strictest sense. But you have to judge ancient literature according to the literary conventions in play at the time of writing, rather than imposing our idea and modern conventions upon them. That would be anachronistic. Some things, now Jesper said, and he's correct, that a lot of scholars today would say that the Gospels do include some events of Jesus that didn't occur, and because they reflect later situations. But a lot of scholars also say that that's not the case, and some would say it could be, but it's not necessarily the case. I think of the story about the poll tax, when they come up to Jesus and say, are we to give taxes to Caesar? That's when Jesus says, do you have a coin to pay the poll tax? And they pull out a denarius, and they say, whose image is that? And, well, Caesar. We'll give to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is to God's. All right. The problem with that is, in Jerusalem, you don't allow any kind of image, even on coins, and Pilate followed that, and he allowed the Jews to mint their own coins. He minted 3 coins in the years 29, 30, and 31. So what are we doing with a poll tax coin with an image of Caesar in Jerusalem? The interesting thing about this, I think, is the irony, because Jesus was always saying that these Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the priests, were hypocrites, and he was pointing this out, and even Josephus has some very bad things to say about the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. So it's kind of like this. Hey, Jesus, hey, let's catch this Jesus guy. Let's get him right. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus knows the hypocrisy. So he said, well, you got a coin to pay the poll tax? Yeah, you got a denarius? Yeah. Well, he knows a denarius has Caesar's image. Yeah, I just happen to have one. Gotcha. They're hypocrites because they're violating their own rule. And this is in Jerusalem, by the way, that this takes place. And people could bring coins into Jerusalem. That's what the money changers were for in the temple, that Jesus would overturn their tables. They were taking coins not permitted and exchanging them for Jewish coins in order to buy the sacrifices. So I think with a lot of these stories in which they say are implausible, they don't pass the criteria of plausibility because they reflect later situations or just seem implausible. If we were to look a little more at the historical information behind them, we might not find them so implausible. I also agree with Jesper on what he calls a simple point, and I think it is simple. The historical Jesus is always the product of the interpreter. That not only applies to Jesus, it applies to every biography ever written. That just shows there's some subjectivity involved. It doesn't mean that what they're writing is false. So what he said is true, but it's also true that some interpretations are more accurate than others. I mean, if I were to say that Jesus encouraged full devotion to the Roman emperor, that is going to be far less accurate than if I said Jesus encouraged full devotion to God. So yes, it's the result of how an interpreter regards Jesus when looking at the data, but some interpretations are more accurate than others. He says that events that violate natural laws are considered unreliable within New Testament scholarship. That's true and it's false. There are many scholars who say that, and there are many scholars who don't say that. fact, there is a living debate going on amongst professional philosophers of history and historians who practice outside of religious studies on the very issue of whether historians can investigate miracle claims. In my large book on the resurrection, I dealt with this in depth and challenged that, the view that says historians cannot investigate miracle claims. Richard Hayes at Duke, a very prominent New Testament, or I'm sorry, not him, but Gerrit Tyson, a moderate New Testament scholar in Germany, says that he wrote an endorsement for the book, and he said that New Testament scholars may have to rethink what they're thinking about whether they can investigate miracle claims and these kinds of things. In History and Theory, in the 2005 issue, the whole thing was devoted to whether historians can investigate miracle claims, and that debate continues. New Testament scholars also debate over this. I admit that I'm in a minority that say that you can investigate miracle claims. But I would say if, at least in theory, if an event occurred, it should be subject to historical investigation, whether or not it's a miracle. I don't see any reason why you couldn't do that. Certainly, you may not be able to say God did it, but you could adjudicate on whether the event occurred. I mean, let's say that astronomers have been looking at a comet for the last decade, and they announce tomorrow that next week, on Wednesday, that comet is going to collide into the moon. And so the Hubble Space Telescope is repositioned to watch it, and planetariums that are going to be in the area are there, they're going to zoom in, and at the appointed time, it happens, and the comet slams into the moon and clears the lunar, there's all this dust, and as the lunar dust settles, they see a message on the moon's surface. And it says, Jesus is Lord, and it's written in Hebrew and Greek. Now, we wouldn't tell those scientists, I mean, maybe the scientists are saying, how did that happen? We have absolutely no explanation how that message got written on the lunar surface. We have no idea, they'd say. Now, they wouldn't turn around and say, well, this would require a miracle for that, and so therefore it is outside the purview of scientists to say that this event occurred. The comet did not hit the moon. They would say the comet hit the moon because that is verifiable, but they wouldn't be able to verify that God created the message. Because God is the cause, historians don't have any kind of tools in order to say God did it. But they do have the tools to say that the event had occurred. They got a telescope. In the same way, a historian could conclude, at least in theory, that Jesus rose from the dead. If the evidence was strong enough, and no plausible naturalistic explanations could account for it, but yet a supernatural one could, and that it occurred in a context in which we might expect a God to act if God exists, then I see no reason for saying that the event occurred. The historian just couldn't say that God did it, that God raised Jesus. And we would have to do like historians do with a lot of things. Acknowledge that the event occurred and refrain from talking about its cause. We just say, we don't know how it happened. So when biblical scholars, whether they're New Testament scholars, Old Testament scholars, whether they're just philosophers of history or they study events outside that are not religious in nature, when you a priori rule out the possibility of investigating a miracle claim, or you come right out and you say events that violate natural laws are unreliable, the stories that talk about events that violate natural laws are unreliable, you are not being a historian. You are weighing in with your worldview, not the facts. And the danger in such a move is quite clear. Bad philosophy corrupts good history. The criterion of plausibility, I agree with him, that's one of our most valuable. I would also add other criteria to that, like multiple independent sources, eyewitness sources, early sources, unsympathetic sources. These are all really good criteria. But what is plausible when it comes to miracles? That's a lot of times going to be in the judgment of the person that is investigating. If a person is an atheist or a deist who would say a higher power exists, but doesn't act in our world, then they're going to look at all the miracle accounts and say all of them are false, without even looking at the evidence. If a person says, okay, I'm agnostic or I'm a theist, then you could look at the accounts and say, hey, I'm open to this. This may or may not have happened. Jesus may have walked on water, he may not have. He may have risen from the dead, he may not have. Let's look at the evidence and see where the evidence points. So we allow the evidence to be our umpire, not our biases and our worldviews. I think that's very important. So I've spent this time kind of agreeing and disagreeing some with what Jesper says. I guess I should just give a little bit of positive evidence for the reliability of the Gospels here, if I can. And that is to say, we as historians cannot prove that everything in the Gospels is true. Any more than historians can prove that everything that Tacitus reports in his life of Agricola, his father-in-law, or his Annals of Rome, or Suetonius' 12 Caesars, or Suetonius' Lives of Illustrious Men, or Plutarch's Lives, or Sallust's War with Catiline, or Caesar's commentaries on the Civil War. In any of those can we prove everything to be reliable. We can show some things to be unreliable in a lot of ancient literature. By my count, there's only a handful of things in the Gospels that I think have a reasonable, maybe a dozen things, but probably no more than a dozen. I wouldn't even say that many, that have a reasonable chance of being mistakes. That's not to say they are, but they have a reasonable chance of being mistakes. That's a very small percentage, and it's all on matters that are peripheral. They're unimportant. Was Quirinius governor of Syria when Augustus took the census? Or is Asa or Asaph the name in Matthew's genealogy? Who's the right one? Did Matthew get that wrong? Or was Mark geographically confused on a couple occasions? These are small matters. They really don't change anything. I conclude, I wish I had more I could cover with that, but let me conclude with this. Jesper asked, are the Gospels historically reliable? And he answered, who cares? Well, I care. And I care because Jesus made some radical claims while on earth. He claimed, and most historians of Jesus agree, that he claimed that he had a special relationship with God who had chosen to usher in his kingdom. That he performed deeds that astonished crowds, and that at least Jesus and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. I think we can go further with things to say that he did claim to be the Son of God, that he came for a purpose. I think we can show historically that it's quite probable that Jesus rose from the dead. And if Jesus is claiming that he provides eternal life or the way to God, I want to know if it's true. I don't want to be a Christian if it's false. I think that would just be a waste of my time in life if I did that. But if it's possible that eternity hangs in the balance with what I do with Jesus, if it is possible that he offers us eternal life, then the matter of the historical reliability of the Gospels is very important. And I certainly care. Thank you.
It shows an interesting difference, I think, also between your tradition, I think, and the Danish one. It was not by coincidence that I referred to Kierkegaard, who would, as I tried to explain, that sees it a complete other way around. That what's about Christianity and eternal life and Jesus' relation to God or something, that is not something that historical facts, as it were, can change or not. That's a matter of faith and belief. And so that it would not, for Kierkegaard, of course, it would not change if it's not true in the historical way, as you point out. And I think that's just to point out an obvious difference between, I guess, I don't count Kierkegaard as sort of my tradition, but anyway, he has had a quite important impact on how we conceive of Christianity, I think. So I expect that there's also one of the differences.
Could I ask you something about that?
Yeah.
So, all right, if there's something in it, like we historians, of course, can't say that we can prove Jesus' death atones for sins. As a Christian, I believe it does, but it's by faith. And so there's a lot of things that we believe by faith. But what if we could prove that Jesus did not rise from the dead? It's not that it's unprovable. Let's say we could prove that he did not rise. He found the bones. And Paul says if Christ has not been raised, our faith is worthless. Wouldn't it be meaningful then if we could disprove that? I mean, that would make a difference, wouldn't it?
No, I don't think so.
Why would I want to be a Christian if Jesus did not rise from the dead? And so the whole story about Jesus, he would have been a failed Messiah and a false prophet. Why should I follow him today?
If it makes sense, I think.
But if he's a false prophet, it would make logical sense to follow him.
But I think
probably need to see a counselor.
It's very, very interesting. This discussion is very, very interesting. It's sort of another discussion that we're supposed to have.
So back to okay. I think I'm very interested.
Okay. Yeah. Because I'm now speaking out from the tradition of Kierkegaard and existential theology, where faith is not and cannot ever be tied to any kind of historical facts, because that would exactly take out the faith part. And the faith has to be an existential leap onto the 20,000 feet of water, or whatever Kierkegaard say, and cannot be tied to any kind of warranty events or facts or whatever. It has to be this existential decision or whatever you call it, and that is the tradition from Kierkegaard and Barth and Buchmann, of course you know it.
Yeah.
So, and I really think that that's a very, very important theological difference. And I've of course tried to speak in sort of what I would claim to be a Danish and European tradition that is this existential philosophical, existential theological tradition. And why would you want to be a Christian? Well, in this tradition you would say, well, if you cannot help not to, cannot help not to be a Christian, because the Christian person emerges when a subject is met by the gospel and faith arises. And it's sort of not it's not something that you could argue for or make plausible or tie to some kind of fact or something. It happens when a subject is met by the gospel and have an existential decision, or I don't know the exact English word, reacts would be probably reacts to the proclamation of the gospel.
So, when I go to the Gospels, I mean, as we both know, the term for faith, belief, is pistos, pistis. So whether I have faith, belief, it's the same word. Okay, so Jesus is out there walking on water in Matthew, and he tells Peter to come. And Peter comes, and then he starts to doubt. Dispazo, think two different things, and he starts to sink. And then Jesus says, "Why did you doubt?" And he's getting on his disciples at times because they're knuckleheads and they're like failing and he doesn't believe. but they still saw him do those things. It's like belief is, it's not this leap in the dark, like a leap of faith, like Lessing's ditch, okay? You got Lessing's ditch, you leap, but it doesn't have to be this really long leap. You can go with evidence so far, and then the leap doesn't have to be a large one. In the book of Acts, Peter says, Jesus has been attested to you. He performed miracles in your midst. Now believe. So they have had the evidence of the belief, and he and Paul would both say, Jesus rose from the dead, and that were eyewitnesses. So there's evidence for it. And Paul in Acts 13 says that Psalm 16:10 says, you will not allow your Holy One to decay. And he says that was not referring to David, because David died, was buried. His body decayed. We know where his tomb is. But Jesus died, buried. His body did not decay, but God raised him and were eyewitnesses. So they presented evidence, but then challenged them to believe. And I think the belief is to take that, we got evidence, but take that last step. You can believe something, but it's moving and following that, making that commitment, which involves, I think, that last step that Jesus is looking. It's a speech act. It's not only here. It's becoming a disciple of Jesus. That's how I take faith. It's acting. It's not like I'm going to believe despite the facts, or if I have facts, then it's not faith. I think you can have a reasonable faith, an informed faith. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's as I said in the beginning, that is two different theological traditions. Where I would say that this, and right now I'm representing the existential theological tradition. I don't know if I really agree with them, but now I'm defending that position. But they would say to you that is exactly why you have all the problems, historical problems, because you are dependent on the evidence until then there's a little leap, and so if you can disprove some of the evidence, the leap will be a little bit bigger, and if you can make it plausible, the leap will be a little bit smaller. But how can you? That would be Kierkegaard, I think. I don't know anything. I don't know much about him. That would be his argument. Then, how can you tie something about your eternal faith to a historical fact that can be disproved? And we said, well, that doesn't make any sense. It has to be this existential reaction, so that it cannot lose its grounds from a historical study of it.
Okay, now from my view, from where I'm coming from, if I had a former classmate, colleague, and that colleague was now an investment advisor, he said, "Hey Mike, you're an old friend, we knew each other from college days. I'm an investment advisor now, and I'm really good. And I want you to take every last penny of the money that you've saved for retirement, and I want you to let me invest it and trust me on it. Before I do something like that, I want to know that he's capable. I want to say, what are your credentials? How long have you been doing this? What's your success rate before I do this?" And he'd say, what if he said, "No, not evidence, because then I might be wrong. You've just got to trust me fully on this." I'd say, "Forget it, pal." And if I wouldn't do that with my retirement funds, why would I do that same thing with my eternal soul?
Just if you can't help it.
I can help it. That's okay.
Yes, but I really think, I doubt it. But that's another thing. But I really think that's important.
Yeah, too.
I really think that's important. It's actually, and I think it's a Protestant tradition with Luther and faith being not not being
Act.
Yeah, an act. And probably many of you know all about that faith cannot be an act, but it's God that finally is the author of faith, or the actor when somebody comes to faith. It's finally the responsibility of God. It cannot be something that human produces on evidence or stories or whatever. Finally, it's God that acts when somebody comes to faith. That would be Luther, and then Luther of Kierkegaard, and all the line of kings. but it's just completely different theological approaches to the question of why is the historical Jesus relevant? Is he theologically relevant, or is he historically relevant? And in this tradition, I think we would separate the two. That was why I sort of ended up with that very, and it was really not meant to be an insult.
I didn't take it.
Okay, good.
Okay, now we have this interesting discussion by two biblical scholars on systematics.
Yes.
I think we'll open the floor for questions, and you're welcome to ask questions of all the topics we have been around. Yes, there.
So my first question is in relation to this, is to Dr. Nielsen. It's whether that's not this liberal Protestant view that you presented, isn't that just a denying of the incarnation, saying that spiritual truths can never be incarnated historically, there can never be any link between the eternal and the historical? Isn't that just denying the incarnation and thereby going outside, I would say going outside what historically has been the Christian tradition, beginning from at least St. Paul, perhaps the Gospels as well? That's, I suppose, kind of what we're discussing here.
About incarnation.
Yeah.
As a what do you? How do you? What do you mean about incarnation?
I mean that. So the way I see it, the basic claim of what historically has been the Christian faith is that Christ has risen from the dead because and as a sign that he was the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the basic idea of the incarnation, is that Christ was the Son of God. But you're saying that no historical facts can ever have anything to do with what the Christian message is, which I'm just saying, well, historically that's just not the case. It's the other way around it. The Christian message has always been a historical claim about Christ, at least a partially historical claim.
Yeah, well, what I try to say is that it is not that history cannot have any kind of value or something. It is when it comes to the question of faith or not. It is, and therefore faith being the precondition for eternal life and whatever. It's not that I will deny any development or something like that. And I think we think a little bit different about incarnation also, because incarnation is usually understood as God becoming man, and that is sort of a bit different, and that is probably maybe it's the case in John, but it's not really developed until after the New Testament, as in a theological way. I don't know if I answered your question.
Perhaps. So I think that there's a question of evidence, which is that maybe the evidence, like Dr. Lencona said, maybe the evidence is that Christ never rose from the dead. You could always say, well, we never had absolutely certain evidence. You could always say, well, there's the evidence, that's only, in the words of Kant, you could say that's only the phenomenon. The case itself could claim that Christ rose from the dead. That could still, in some way, be true. Would you still consider that necessary for Christian faith, that you should still believe that Christ had, in that very straightforward sense, risen from the dead, even if you are presented with evidence to the contrary? Or would you say that's not even, that's not relevant?
I think
that's what I'm getting.
I get your point now, and that's a very good one, because
If you saw the bones of Jesus, would you say, who cares?
yeah, probably. but what I would not care, what I would care if the texts that that Christianity is based on, if they changed completely into something else, I think that would make a big difference, actually. Because Christianity, as I understand, is also to be included in a understanding of God and man and what it means to be man. And that understanding is based on the text that we consider Bible and has developed from that. So that would change if you say, I think that's also why I'm an exegete. I think that's very important for our understanding of God and man, these texts and what they express. You see?
So, I'm going to ask you something, Mike. So, do you believe Jesus actually rose from the dead?
Well, that is
Whether it's provable or not, let's say.
it's a very personal question, but I would answer yes.
Okay, so you think Jesus actually rose from the dead. So if they discovered the bones of Jesus, and somehow they were able to verify these they came in an ossuary, and it's the bones of a crucified victim, and there's a piece of papyrus inside that says, "We fooled the world until today," and it's signed by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? And they test the DNA on it, and it matches the Shroud of Turin DNA. So there's the bones of Jesus. We know he did not rise from the dead. Would you at that point say, doesn't matter?
Yeah.
You would?
Yeah.
Would you still believe he rose?
Yeah. Because that belief, and I think I insist on, even if you're systematic, maybe you tell me that I'm completely wrong about both Bultmann and Barth, and probably not Bultmann, but certainly Barth and Luther and whatever. But I think really this Protestant tradition, belief or faith is not so much about what happens once, but how you understand yourself and your neighbor and God, because that's part of it. It's really not about what happened once in Palestine. So you can also express it in another way than when we talk about a meaning behind the text, or in the text, or in front of the text. Because a text may create meaning in all three dimensions. Today in our talks, we have talked about the meaning behind the text, what it refers to. We could also have a seminar talking about the meaning that is narratively created inside the text, with all the narrative structures and whatnot. You know that. And we could have another seminar about the meaning of the text, the meaning that is created when people actually take this text as Bible. And what does it mean for your understanding of yourself, your understanding of your neighbor, your understanding of God, and whatever. And what does that, what are the consequences? And that is, I think, the important thing about Christianity. That's the meaning in front of the book.
I guess for me, it would be, I could remain a Christian. When I did my investigation of the resurrection of Jesus, if the evidence if the evidence was inconclusive, I could remain a Christian. I do think the evidence very strongly suggests he rose from the dead, and that encouraged me. But the evidence pointed against the resurrection. I couldn't remain a Christian. No.
Okay, I think we'll take another question. We have one here in the middle.
Yes, it's a question to Michael Coleman. It's regarding your methodological approach. Let's suppose we find a text from ancient history and it's about Baal. And he intervenes in this world and makes a miracle. And we are in a Christian tradition, and we read the Christian literature and the Christian texts, and your approach to these texts are you're open to these miracles.
Yes.
Would you be as open to a text about Baal, and why not, or why? And would you treat Islamic text or Buddhist text in the same way? And if not, why treat the Christian text in that way?
Yeah, fair question. Yes, I would be open. I'd have to, as a historian, to be open to those things. But I would look for evidence. So several years ago, I had a friend who was a former Mormon bishop. That would be like a pastor in a church. And we became good friends. And we knew we were going to talk about it. And it was just a matter, I think we both wanted to know that the other person truly cared about the other. And we had a friendship. So finally one day he broached the topic with me, and he asked if I'd ever talked to Mormon missionaries, and I said yes. And he said, would you be willing to talk to them again? And I said yes. I said, but just to let you know, I really don't care what Mormonism thinks unless I am fairly convinced that it's true. And then I really want to know what it thinks. So when we get together, I want to know what's the evidence of Mormonism. So he said, all right, we'll do it. So we arranged for like 2 weeks in advance. So I had 2 weeks, and I was going to do a little study. And I knew they were going to ask me to read the Book of Mormon and pray with a sincere heart to ask God if it's true. So I did. Because I figured when it comes to truth, I don't have to fear truth. What I do have to fear is that my biases, which I do have, everybody has them, but that my biases will get in the way and prevent me from discovering truth, and it may cost me eternity. That's what keeps me up at night sometimes. And so I read a bunch of the Book of Mormon. I prayed with a sincere heart. I also called Book of Mormon archaeologists, professors in the anthropology department at BYU, and asked them what evidence there was that the Book of Mormon is true. And one of them does archaeological work in New York, near Rochester. The other does it in Central America, and they both told me there isn't a scrap of evidence, archaeological evidence, that specifically confirms the Book of Mormon. In fact, there's some things that seem to disconfirm it. And so we had an interesting discussion when I got with the missionaries. But yeah, I was open to it at that point, but I want evidence. So I would look at Baal. I would look at things from other religions. And I did. When I did look at some things from other, for Islam, for Buddhism, and for Hinduism. And I've also considered the arguments for atheism, and I'm convinced that the evidence points quite strongly to the resurrection of Jesus being an event that occurred in history. And that's why I'm a Christian today.
Question out there?
Yeah, it's a question to Jesper Nielsen. You talked about interpreting the facts, how scholars interpret the facts differently, and that we have to, like, always considering how much is historical about Jesus in the Gospels. We have to interpret them. And then you talked about Kierkegaard and this existential tradition. But don't you think that in doing that, you are giving too much authority to Kierkegaard as an interpreter of the facts? If you understand.
Yeah, I think I understand. But no, I'm not a big fan of him. So I tend to agree with you, but I would not say that it's an interpretation of facts. I think it's Kierkegaard's interpretation of Christianity. And after him, Bart Bultmann, and I like Bultmann a lot more than Kierkegaard. But in that tradition, yeah, but that is, you're right that I sort of endorse this tradition in what I've been saying about faith and so on, and there could be other interpretations of Christianity that could be different, but I think, even though I don't agree with them in everything, I think that the idea of Christianity not being dependent on so-called facts is very important. And this existential subject or whatever reaction to the gospel as a proclamation, I think that is a very important interpretation of Christianity that is, it's very important for Christianity in a modern world. So, but in a way you're right.
I think we'll close here. We have a question on it.
Yeah, it's also for this. We might, for the sake of argument, call Paul the founder of Christianity. Maybe Brandisius would even say that he invented Christianity. And now, in the First Corinthians, as you mentioned before, someone, it seems very important as a topic, this to Paul himself, whether or not Christ has risen from the dead as a foundation for our faith. Do you think Paul is wrong in this aspect? We have a letter here from, maybe some scholars would say it's one of the 3 or 4 first writings of the New Testament canon. Is he in the wild here, or according to your position? Because he seems to emphasize this quite a lot.
Well, I have to say yes, doesn't it? I don't.
It is a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think that what Paul says in chapter 15 in 1 Corinthians is very tied up in a very specific worldview, and it's also tied to a very specific argument with the Corinthians, in which he is not trying to prove Christianity at that point. He's trying to prove the resurrection of the bodies. That is sort of the resurrection of the body, or the resurrection in chapter 15, as I read it. I would say that with Paul, really, what he said that Christianity is dependent on the historical fact of the resurrection. Then I would say he is.
I would like to I agree with that. I just want to add to it that, yes, Paul, he is one of, and perhaps the earliest writer in the New Testament. But Paul also says there, I delivered to you what I also received. And then he goes on to say, whether I or they, the other apostles, this is what we preach. And this is what, so Paul is preaching not only what he thinks is important in terms of the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, and saying our future afterlife, our salvation is directly linked to his historical resurrection. He's saying this is what the other apostles are preaching too. This is what the earliest Christians, this is what the apostles, those who walked with Jesus, were preaching. He rose from the dead, and because he rose, we can also have eternal life. The historicity of the resurrection of Jesus was important to the original apostles. This wasn't something that was a legend that developed over time. It was something that goes back to the very earliest Christians in the very earliest time.
We have a question up here.
Yeah, this is a question for you, Mike. I need you to help me out because you have made some very good points, some very good academic points. But put yourself in my situation. You're approached by this electrician, and he has seen one 10-minute long YouTube video called Why Christianity is Fake. And he comes up to you and he says, as they always do, there are no reliable non-Christian sources to the historical Jesus. Now, what would you say to that guy?
I would say Jesus is mentioned by a few non-Christian sources, like Josephus mentions him twice in his Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, section 63, that has been tainted by a Christian that is doctored up a little, but virtually all Josephus scholars would say that he does mention Jesus there, and it's usually things like he performed astonishing deeds, he preached to Jews and Gentiles, that Pilate, at the instigation of the Jewish leaders, crucified him, and his disciples continued to follow him. In book 20, section 200, Josephus mentions the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Messiah. You've got Tacitus, who mentions the execution of Jesus by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. You have Lucian of Samosata mentioned the crucifixion of Jesus in Palestine. You have Mar bar Serapion mention Jesus' execution sometime. The letter, we don't know when it's dated, but it's either late 1st century or sometime in the 2nd century. But I would also say that we don't need just non-Christian sources. I can look at the Quran, which I do not by any means think is divinely inspired, and I can come to it as a student of history, and I can learn certain things. So when a surah says, one of the chapters in it, God asks Jesus, did you say that you, me, and Mary are all gods? And Jesus responds, far be it from me to have said that, Allah. I've only said that you are God and I'm your servant. Now, I don't believe that that conversation ever took place. But as a student of history, I can conclude that in the 7th century, when the Quran was written, that Muslims misunderstood some of the debates amongst Catholics about a high view of Mary, and misunderstood that for saying she's a god, and saying that there's this trinity of Father, Son, and Mary, and that they were denying that Jesus is a god in any sense. All right, I can conclude that just from the Quran. And so even atheist and agnostic historians like Bart Ehrman and others can come to the Gospels and say they are the most credible sources about Jesus, and there's much we can learn from them as historians.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Yeah, it's a question about the difference in your what do you call it? The difference in your views on Christianity or on faith. And what I'm asking, or what I'm thinking a little bit about, is that the Bible in many ways tells scholars to be very fanatic, and like is to leave your don't trust your own mind, trust God, and don't. Paul says, or whatever somebody else tells you about everything or about this, never leave this what I've told you before. And in some ways, I can see that in what you're talking about. No matter what proof I will see tomorrow, it will not change my faith. But because the Bible tells us like that God is the Almighty, He is the one that we trust. Don't trust yourself. But if you, what I'm hearing a little bit is that if you tomorrow, with your mind, will find proof that Jesus did not die, then you would not believe Him anymore. Then in some way you're like above. That it's your mind that is I don't know if you understand my question.
I understand what you're saying. Yeah, almost like I'm putting my own logic in mind ahead of God. Mm-hmm. All right, but then what I might say is, well, how do you know ahead of time that Christianity is true? You're assuming ahead of time that Christianity is true. Whatever worldview one takes, whether it's atheism, agnosticism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, whatever worldview we take it by faith. There is a degree of faith. Okay. I'm a second guesser. I second guess everything, not just my faith, but everything. And I hate that about myself. It's an idiosyncrasy, and it's frustrating to me. It frustrates my wife. It's just frustrating. Okay. But something as important, if God exists, and if our eternity, and I say if our, I mean, there's so many different worldviews out there. I don't want to just take the one Christianity because that's the way I was brought up. I want to look at it objectively. And I put it on the table and say, well, maybe it's wrong. Let's look at the evidence. When I was doing my investigation of the resurrection, I'd pray and I'd say, God, listen, I'm putting it all on the table, and if I'm sinning, forgive me, but I got to do this. Because I'm after truth. And if the truth points away from Christianity, I'm leaving. If the truth points toward Christianity, I'm all in. Eternity is just too important to me. It's the most important thing to me. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. Unfortunately, most people spend more time choosing their next car than they will on where they, their worldview. And that our worldviews impact how we live our lives, our political views, the moral decisions we make. It impacts so much. So I need evidence. And I know there's still faith, but I need evidence. Call me Thomas.
Okay, unfortunately we don't have any more time, so I think we should give a good applause for